Hello, Dr. Barnes here with feedback on week 6 for Introduction to the New Testament. First of all, I apologize for the quality of this video. I'm having to sneak it in. I have two sick 4-month-olds right now, and this is the only time I have. So, anyway, I just wanted to explain a little bit more the nature of Paul's ministry in First Thessalonians, or in Thessalonica, and in Galatia, Rome, and Corinth. Now, he was in Thessalonica first, and then he went to Galatia, and then, the rest is history. And Romans was last. Rome was last, so the order would be Thessalonica, then Galatia, then Corinth, and then Rome. And in that, in these letters, we can see Paul's development of his thinking and in his missionary strategy. Like, how did he build churches, and how did he win people to his to Christianity and his version of Christianity? So I taught that, and I teach, and I write that there was a problem in Thessalonica, and the problem is that Paul used something called corrective speech. Now, this type of speech can only be used with friends, like with people who know you. And he can use corrective speech with the church. He can be very bold in what he says and very um, direct and even hurtful, and things that would normally offend people that don't know him would be welcomed by those who do know him. So in Thessalonica, there is a conspicuous lack of support for the church. You know the church is persecuted. Well, that means that they don't have any protection. Wealthy people, patrons, provided legal protection, and also they had their own people, if you will, that could take care of things, in the streets. They could send out an assassin to kill you if they need to. So there's that. So the Thessalonians were vulnerable to attacks from people that didn't like them. And the reason why they were vulnerable is because they did not have a wealthy person in the community that could protect them, by force or with the law. So that's one thing. The other thing is, in Romans, Galatians, and First Corinthians, and every other book for that matter, Christian worship is done in the context of meals. And these meals have a very specific setting. Paul says whenever you are invited to a meal, this is what you do. Now, whenever he says that in First Corinthians, he is saying it exactly like invitations to dinner that wealthy people would send each other. They would use a slave and send a friend an invitation to dinner, and it would look exactly like what Paul says in First Corinthians. So, and then he goes on to say, if you eat meat sacrificed to idols, this is what you need to do in the household whenever you go. Poor people did not have homes, and they did not have meals, and they did not invite each other to meals. They had their meals together in tenement housing, or out on the streets. They didn't have it inside of homes. So we know from the context in Romans and First Corinthians and Galatians that the Christians there had wealthy people in the community, and these wealthy people would host Christian gatherings, and the gatherings would be centered around a meal, and that's how we came to have the Lord's Supper. It's a product of these Christians getting together in the earliest days. So there are two contexts that are lacking conspicuously in Thessalonica. One of them is protection from people who want to hurt them, and the other is a meal context that tells us that there's a wealthy person in the community. So Paul failed in some regard, where he succeeded in others. He succeeded in getting a wealthy person to support the church in these other cities. And so you have to ask yourself, or I have to ask as a scholar, why is that? Well, I think that Paul makes it pretty clear in 1 Corinthians that he talked to outsiders like he was supposed to talk, or he talked to insiders in the other cities. So he learned that he needed to develop closer friendships with people before he let them know that things like sexual immorality is something that God does not like, or which is sexual immorality was just a way of life back then, and we see that in Corinth that the Christians wanted to continue in this kind of free lifestyle. So and also that idols are demons, and if you support idol worship, you are turning your back on the Creator. That's pretty tall or pretty offensive things to say to people, and he paid for it. Now, he can tell that to Christians. Whenever he writes to Galatia, writes to Corinth, he's writing to the church, and he's saying, that you need to clean up your act and change your ways, or God's going to punish you. That's something that you can't tell someone that's not your friend in the ancient world, and Paul learned that in Thessalonica. So we know that by reading the letter, that Paul used some pretty pointed speech with outsiders. Now that's the point, outsiders. Inside the church they already like him. He can come down on them as hard as he wants, and it's frank speech, it's corrective speech, but it's corrective speech to a friend and not to an outsider. Okay. Sometimes we forget our point. Let me think for just a second. Okay, I think I've told you everything. So there was a lot of confusion about Paul making a mistake in Thessalonica, and I just wanted to make it clear what I was saying, because some of the questions were not what I taught. So anyway, thank you so much for taking the course, and hope to see you soon. I gotta repeat this because it is complicated. Paul used corrective speech to someone who was not his friend, and that's very offensive in the ancient times. And this is a point that I forget to make. We have the same kind of thing in our culture, and a really good example is someone who does not know how to do your job, has never done it before. Whenever they approach you and tell you that you're doing it wrong, that's something that's very offensive to a lot of us. You don't know what I'm going through, so you can't tell me. And I've been doing this for 10, 13 years. You've never done this particular job. It is not in your job description to criticize me. That's something that is offensive speech. It's corrective speech. And if you try to correct someone and it's not your job to correct them and you've never done that before, that's something that can be incredibly offensive, and it can get you into some trouble sometimes. The other thing that is offensive is whenever someone tells you how to discipline your child when you don't know them. That's a corrective speech that offends. And so what I think Paul did was he told people how to do their jobs, and he tried to tell people how to discipline their children. Not literally. This is a comparison between cultures. He made people mad by what he said, and it cost him. And I think that he approached Rome and Galatia and Thessalonica differently. How do we know that? Well, it solves the same problem there. Why are people in Rome and Thessalonica and Galatia, why are they not persecuted like the Thessalonians? Well, in those three cities, or in those three letters, you have evidence that there are wealthier people in the congregation, and Paul won them over somehow, and he won them over by, first of all, not offending them, and second of all, he knew how to keep them. So he knew how to write his letters in a corrective way within the context of friendship that addressed what the patrons were doing, what the rich people were doing, because he wanted to keep the support for the church alive. And he was able to do that in those 3 cities. So that's the argument. Hope you're well. Bye-bye.